Hello, my name is John R. Brower, and I'd like to talk about my great uncle Carl Quickert, who was the first person to write a book about the history of Washington County, Wisconsin. Today is January 2nd, 2021, but I originally gave this talk in 2017. Here's my website, and I am still an adjunct professor at Milwaukee School of Engineering. And here's my mailing address and my email. Feel free to contact me. As I said, this talk was originally given in 2017 on April 15th at West Bend, Wisconsin, which is the county seat of Washington County. And this was given for the Washington County Historical Society. The outline of this talk is as follows. First, I'll give an introduction. Then I'll talk about the Quickerts in Germany. Carl Quickert was born in Germany. I'll talk about them. Then we'll talk about their descendants in the United States. Then my memories of Carl's sister, my grandmother, who I called Old Grandma. Then I'll also talk about my mother and her Uncle Carl. And then about what he did in West Bend, the books he wrote. And finally, will be a conclusion. So you've seen me for enough now, so I'll turn myself off here. The introduction, he died at age 82 in March 1951 when I was 7.5 years old. So I didn't know him well at all. But I do recall attending his funeral in West Bend. He never married. I am 1/4 Quickert, along with my brother Bill, my sister Mary Alice, and our cousin Mike Gangler, and then there are some others as well, Schlegels. I'll talk a little bit about that. My grandmother was his sister, and of course she knew him very, very well. My mother and aunt also knew him well, and they all told me quite a bit about him. I'm only an amateur historian at best and have never lived in Washington County. I earned a PhD in electrical engineering from UW-Madison, and when I was there in the late 1960s, I first read his book, History of Washington County, in the State Historical Society library there in Madison. Here's a family tree, a partial family tree of the Quickerts in Germany. They stayed there until 1882. Carl's parents were Jacob Quickert and Amalia Quickert, and there are the dates. Jacob was born in Germany in 1836, Amalia in 1844. Their first child was Carl Quickert, and he was born in 1869 and died in 1951. And you can find at least one of his books on Amazon.com. If you search there. The second oldest was Fred Quickert, born a year later. He went to California, and his grandson, Dr. Marvin Quickert, invented an eye surgery method. See Google for that, the Quickert method. So he was a famous eye surgeon, died early of a scuba diving accident, unfortunately. Tragedy. Their third child was Anna Quickert, and their fourth child was my grandmother, Johanna Quickert, called Jenny by everybody. And she lived until 1958, when I was 15. So I knew her very well. A source of many of these dates is cemeteries.org, which is the Milwaukee Catholic Cemeteries website. It shows that all but Fred are buried at Calvary Cemetery in Milwaukee. That's just west of the baseball stadium. And this excellent website covers all of the Milwaukee Archdiocese, including West Bend. Here's a brief autobiography by CarlQuickert. That's from his book, his first book. I'll just read what's underlined here. He was born in Zweibrücken, which is in the Palatinate of the Rhine, Germany, in 1869. His father, Jacob Quickert, was the technical manager of a tannery, the largest one in the province. And up to his 10th year, he attended public school and then entered Realschule, an intermediate school like our high schools. After attending that for 4 years, he was apprenticed to a wholesale merchant and banker. And meanwhile, his father had resigned his position, which he had for 19 years. And the family moved to the vicinity of Heidelberg, Germany, where his father intended to buy a tannery. That's the business he knew. But the deal could not be perfected to his satisfaction, so then he decided to visit America with his family. And that turned into a permanent stay for all of us, for the family and us ancestors. Here's where Zweibrücken is. Zweibrücken means two bridges. Let's see if I can find. Whoops, I want to back out here. Let's see if I can figure out how to back out. I want to go backwards. I accidentally went forward. Okay. Let's see. I have to figure out how to back out of this. I am not having any luck. Just a second. Let me pause this. Well, the backing up doesn't seem to be working, so I'll proceed here. Zweibrücken, if you looked at those maps, is quite, it's about 130 kilometers west of Heidelberg. It's right near the border with France, and therefore that's where the Franco-Prussian War occurred right around 1870, which was one of the main reasons why Jacob Quickert decided to go to America, because he didn't want his children, his sons, to be involved in that war. So here's a better family tree, a bigger one, showing the descendants of the Quickerts in Germany, in the United States. As you see here, he left Germany in 1882 with Amalia, but all of his children were born in Germany. So my grandmother was 5 years old when she moved with her family to the United States. So she did not speak with any German accent. She spoke English just perfectly. Carl, I understand, since he was older, spoke with a German accent, spoke English with a German accent. My grandmother Jenny married Henry Schlegel on the upper right there, and they had children. The first one was Henry A. Schlegel, and he was born in 1901 and died in 1961. His second child was Alice Schlegel, who married Carl Gengler, and she lived from 1906 to 2000. And they have a son, Michael. And then the third child was my mother, Elizabeth Ida Schlegel, who married Robert C. Brower, my father. And then Anna Quickert, on the left there, she married Eugene Hettenbach, and they had one child, Marie Hettenbach, who lived until 2005. And at the bottom of the slide here, you can see me, John Robert Brower, married Susan in 1982, William Richard Brower, my younger brother married Sylvia in 1981. They have 3 children, Laura, Andrea, and John Michael. And then our sister, Mary Alice Brower, born in 1949. And also related to the Quickerts, descended from the Quickerts, are in the lower right-hand corner, John Schlegel, lived until 2016 and has a number of children. And then he had a brother, Richard Schlegel, who died in 1959. So that's the Quickert descendants in the United States. Here's a picture of Carl Quickert. That's from his History of Washington County, which is in 2 volumes. I'll talk about that more later. This was that was published in 1912, so obviously this picture was taken before either 1912 or before. And the Washington County Historical Society kindly found this photo of my great uncle Carl, taken in West Bend High School in around 1937. So here's my great uncle Carl with the vest, with the glasses and the vest. And what's interesting is now I am the great uncle of a current student at West Bend High School, Zach Church. So great uncles do abound. Here's a continuation of Carl's autobiography. They moved to Milwaukee shortly after arriving in the United States, and he entered the composing room of a German daily, the Milwaukee Herald, and learned how to set type. And he has since then, as he says there, stayed with printing and with newspapers and with books and publishing. And about 14 years before this was written, in 1912, I believe, he accepted a position with the Washington County Publishing Company, West Bend. So he moved from Milwaukee to West Bend because they had a German weekly, the West Bend Beobachter, which they published in conjunction with the West Bend News, which was an English paper. And he started writing articles, especially about the old German settlers. And he hunted up historical material, and so that's how he started to become a historian. So you can read the rest of that at your leisure. 5 years ago, he collected the sketches in a volume called Gedenkblätter zur Besiedelung von Washington County, Wisconsin, auf Deutsch. And then the State Historical Society asked him to join, but he realized that German language was in the decline, and that certainly was the case when World War I started. The editor of the German weekly deemed it better for him to write in English. So he started that and became amazingly good at it. And he feels happiest when he was close in touch with his books. And he also liked to take long walks into the country because he was a nature lover. Now, a lot of that is still the case in my family. He and his sisters, my grandmother, for example, never drove. So they took the train. Here's a picture of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad Depot in West Bend. It was an important stop on the line between Milwaukee and Fond du Lac. And here's when I was younger, I took that train. And here's a schedule I saved from 1969 showing that you could get from Chicago and Milwaukee to Green Bay by 2 different routes. One was a lakeshore route, which is at the bottom of the timetable there. And just above that is the West Bend route via Fond du Lac and Oshkosh. And so you can see there, it took only about an hour from Milwaukee to West Bend. Oh, no, not that long, no. You see there they left at 1:10 and arrived in West Bend at 1:59. So it only took about 49 minutes or less, which is pretty good even for nowadays. And those trains, then you used to be able to go from there all the way, from Green Bay all the way up to Ashland, and I took those trains several times. Remains of the railroad do exist today in West Bend, even though passenger service ended in 1972, and the railroad was abandoned in 1999, as was most of the Chicago Northwestern to Ashland. But my wife and I have enjoyed taking the Eisenbahn Trail, which is the remains of that iron railroad, and it's a tribute to Washington County's German heritage, and it's a wonderful trail for bicycling, hiking, etc. And hopefully you've enjoyed that, and the county is to be congratulated for saving that trail and for restoring the railroad depot. Okay, next I'd like to talk about some memories typed by my Aunt Alice Schlegel Gengler in 1977. She talks here about Jacob, the father of my grandmother Jenny and CarlQuickert. He was rejected by the German army because his heart had been affected by medicine that he took for that purpose. So he was not a fan of armies, and as I said, that's one reason why, prime reason why they moved to America. His wife Amalia was also born in Germany, and she was really the head of the household, disciplinarian. My grandmother told of how every child had to eat everything on their plate, among other things. So you can read that at your leisure. But she was fairly important person in the family. And the children were all born in Germany. Fred, there actually was a twin, but the twin died early, evidently. And then there was Tante Anna, Annie, and Carl, the subject of of this talk. As she says here, he worked as a reporter first for the Milwaukee German newspaper, then moved to West Bend when the Milwaukee paper stopped publishing, probably. And he was successful in changing from writing in German to writing in English, but he never did lose his German accent. But as Aunt Alice says, and I remember, my grandmother Jenny could speak German but spoke English with no accent at all. And it says later Carl became editor of the West Bend paper, but gave up his position during the recession to a young man whom he felt needed the job more than he did. But he continued to write feature articles for the paper and wrote poetry, and of course then he started writing his books. And we'll talk more about that. And toward the end there it says his favorite philosopher was Schopenhauer, and he was an agnostic for years but returned to the Catholic Church during his terminal illness. And he's buried in the Quickert lot at Calvary Cemetery, west of the stadium in Milwaukee. Here are memories of my grandmother Jenny. Attended St. Mary's School until she was confirmed, probably about age 12, probably, about 6th grade, and then went to work for Barrett's department store in downtown Milwaukee as a cash girl. And then she married, she worked at the hardware store. I remember her telling about she worked in the hardware department of this department store. And then she married Henry Schlegel, my grandfather, whom I never met because he died about a week after I was born in 1943. He was in real estate, a firm known as Richter, Dick & Reutemann, and became an insurance salesman and real estate salesman. And they lived first at 47th and Lisbon, near there. And you can read further there that my mother was born in their home on about 40th Street north of North Avenue. And they also had cabins on Tishigan Lake, southwest of Milwaukee, and later Little Cedar Lake, which is in Washington County. Here's a photo from a stereo slide I took around 1977. That's about the time Aunt Alice typed those memories. There's her husband, Carl Gangler, my sister Mary Alice, and my mother and father, all down in Florida. They moved to Florida, the Ganglers moved to Florida, and we visited them down there. Whoops. Again, I can't get the backspace to work here for some reason. Too bad that was a picture of me and my grandmother in when I was only about a year old. But we'll skip that because I accidentally skipped it, and I can't figure out how to go back here. This is when we built a new house on 89th Street in Wauwatosa. This is O-Grandma, as I called her. Called her that because she taught me to read the letter O to distinguish her from my grandmother Brower, who was also an important person in my life. And this is my sister Mary Alice at a very young age, and the house is brand new as well. Here's a note that my grandmother sent me around 1955. This was when I was at Boy Scout camp. And she says, "My dear John, hope you are having a wonderful time swimming, canoeing, eating, and doing your chores," which I hope will not be too many. Hope you also have fine weather. See you soon. Love, O-Grandma. That's the way she wrote. It was very conversational. And her Carl Quickert, her brother, has a lot of that too. It makes him a good writer. And unlike Carl, whom I rarely saw, my grandmother, we saw her just about once a week. She lived in an apartment at 2325 North 50th Street in Milwaukee, and we lived on 89th Street, and we would take the trackless trolley to visit her, because back in those days, we only had one car, and my father was using that for business, so we took the public transportation, and the trackless trolleys were really fun. They would take off like a Tesla car does now. In other words, their acceleration could be fabulous because they were lightweight and powered by the overhead double wire that you see there. And a few cities still have those, but they were an advance over the noisy and smelly diesel and gasoline buses, and also they were an alternative to the trolley with tracks, obviously. So that was fun going there. Okay, now we're at the section called My Mother and Her Uncle Carl. So here's a stereo slide I took in 1981 of our family trip to Germany, where we tried to retrace the Quickerts and the Quickerts. There's my sister Mary Alice, my brother Bill with his fiance at the time, Sylvia, and my father and mother. And we rented a Volkswagen bus, as you can see there, and drove around. And one place we went to was Zweibrücken. And since it's the city of Rossen und Rosa, which means horses and roses, they have a lovely rose garden there. And there's my mother on the right, my father, and my brother Bill near a pond in the rose garden in Zweibrücken. We also visited Heidelberg, the last German home of the Quickerts, which is the famed site of the Student Prince operetta and movie. Didn't have the greatest weather there, as you see. This is again a stereo slide of my dad, mother, Mary Alice, Sylvia, and Bill. But we did go there, which is the last home of the Quickerts in Germany. One thing I knew for sure about Uncle Carl is that every Christmas for over 10 years, when we opened our Christmas presents, he would have a present for my mother, and it was always a leather-bound book by Dickens. So Dickens wrote quite a few books, at least 10. So I definitely read Tale of Two Cities that from the book that he gave. They were quite small, leather-bound, very nice, and that's at least one of the books that I read. But he gave about 10 of them. My mother then majored in English at Marquette University, where she graduated magna cum laude with a president's pin for the best grade point average. So, he had an influence there. As I said, I remember reading Tale of Two Cities. He visited my mother and her folks during the 4 or 5 summers they spent on Little Cedar Lake in Washington County. My mom's father drove them there in a Kissel car. They had a Kissel car, which was made in Washington County in Hartford. And later they had a Pierce Arrow. And in fact, we had some of the suitcases that came with the Pierce Arrow. I used them as a child. After his funeral mass that I attended, we went to his downtown West Bend hotel room. I recall it was not on the first floor. I think it was either the second or third floor. And it had a nice view of the front of the building and the main street standing, and the building still stands at 228 North 6th Avenue. It's now the Washington House Pub, and there's a historical plaque nearby that says it was built in 1864. So that's where he lived all those years in West Bend. So the year that was 1951 when we were there, when he died. We were at his funeral, and we were all young. There's my mother on the right with me on the left, and my younger brother Bill and sister Mary Alice. That was how old we were at the time. So I do remember the funeral a bit and going to his room in the hotel, but beyond that, I don't remember too much. Now let's talk about his books. And just a little chronology here. He was born in 1869. The Franco-Prussian War occurred in 1870 to 1871. So I guess the family survived that, but since Jacob had young children, young boys, he wanted to get out of there. Immigrated to the United States in 1882, so he was 13, and that's why he retained a German accent. He worked approximately those years for the Milwaukee Herald, in a German newspaper. And then in 1899, he moved to West Bend, worked for the Beobachter till 1907, when he began writing in English for the West Bend News. And he wrote the history of Washington County in German in 1907, and in English in 1912 when he was 43 years old. Of course, then World War I against the Germans, that was a big influence. He was glad then that he could write in English. And he also wrote a book called The Story of Washington County in 1923. It's sort of an update. Little Cedar Lake Family Summers, he was 59 to 63. And then he published his poetry book, Green Hills and Crystal Lakes. He self-published that in 1950 at age 81 and died a year later in West Bend. So that's a chronology. His writings for the German and English papers, based on their archives of past issues, became the basis for his book, Washington County, Wisconsin, Past and Present, published in 1912 by the S.J. Clark Publishing Company. Volume 1 is a history of Washington County, available at Amazon.com because it was published before copyright laws were in force. So there's no copyright on that. He also wrote a volume 2, which is a biographical sketches of about 160 prominent residents of the county, including some photos, including his own that I showed you earlier. That's available for viewing at the Wisconsin Historical Society website. And there's the URL for that. Let's talk about his groundbreaking history book. It has a foreword, 29 chapters, and a short epilogue. Starts with geology of the region, followed by chapters on Native Americans. In other words, it's in chronological order, you could say. It has a lovely description of his hike with friends to find Indian mounds at what is now Lizard Mound County Park. And my wife Sue and I recently visited that county park. It is quite interesting. But back then it was just, wasn't a park, I believe. It was just, but people realized that they should preserve it. I'm glad they did. Next, he just discussed the white pioneers, including the formation of the county in 1848, which is, I believe, the same year the state of Wisconsin was incorporated. Next comes some chapters on immigrant groups, Yankees and Germans, and then the coming of the railroads and their impact. Its chapters on the Civil War period show his natural and sometimes humorous writing style and his new language, English. He really could write well. This is an example. The population could not understand why there should be a war, since no enemy was attacking the country. Then the question arose, when the North and South fight each other, who is right? Then they could understand little or no English, and their German paper decried the draft and covertly encouraged resistance. Finally, they had suspicion there was no fair play at the draft. And that was why on the morning of the draft day, a mob of nearly 1,000 heads and armed with many kinds of weapons appeared before the courthouse and without any kind of parley stormed it. To do this, it did not take much bravery, for the building was in an utterly defenseless condition. So it's interesting writing, and that's just an example. Chapters 18 through 29 discuss various aspects of the county and their history and present state. Included are schools, agricultural organizations, environment, including the lakes, churches, industries, politics, and finally the press. West Bend News started in 1858. And there's a large appendix in this book that you can get from Amazon. It's a list of hundreds of members of the Washington County Old Settlers Club, which met at Carl's Hotel and in 1954 became the Washington County Historical Society. There's also a volume 2 with 356 pages containing 160 biographies with 15 photo portraits, including the authors, on black and white plates, and a 3-page history of the Kissel Motor Car Company. In addition to those volumes, he also published books in 1923 and 1950. The story of Washington County was copywritten under the new copyright law in 1923. It's available at wisconsinhistory.org. But as it's most of the chapters are based upon the former work, but many have been entirely rewritten to come up to the results of the latest historical researches that he was doing, evidently. It has fewer chapters and smaller pages. It's less personal. I don't like it quite as much as the book that's available on Amazon. Then his other book is Green Hills and Crystal Lakes, Poems of the Wisconsin Kettle Moraines. Written and published in 1950, has 155 pages. My sister Mary Alice has a copy of it. It's a very nice book with very lovely poems about nature. And it definitely shows his love of nature that's continued by our family. We love natural things, birds and trees and gardens and flowers, and love to get out and hike or ski or bicycle in nature. So I'm glad to hear that Washington County Historical Society is thinking of republishing it. To my knowledge, it's not available yet. So in conclusion, thank you for watching this. I would like to thank my family for help in preparing this talk, and Jessica Sawinski-Couch of the Historical Society for inviting me. I think you can conclude with me that Carl Quickert was truly a great uncle by the work he did on history and poetry. Is a great uncle. And by preparing this talk, I now more fully appreciate him than I ever did. So better late than never. His accomplishments are amazing considering his very limited education in Germany only. That he could write so well in English just amazes me. His command of English puts many of us native-born Americans to shame. He is an example of how immigrants can truly serve America in a lasting fashion. One more thing, which I forgot to put in. As Carl Quickert wrote, as a valuable unit of a state that carries the proud motto forward on our great seal and acts upon it so steadfastly, the county cannot help progressing on sound economic lines and enjoys the happiness that comes from well-spent energies. Here's good luck to Washington County. Yay. And thank you again for listening.